Hello, you're listening to The Jury Box. This podcast offers a rare opportunity to step into the role of a juror. In each episode, you'll hear a real trial as jurors heard it, the facts, the law, and the arguments on both sides. Before the verdict is revealed, you'll be asked to make your own decision. So, take a breath and step into the jury box.
Welcome to the jury box.
Please, come in. Take your seat.
We're going to ask something of you today.
Yeah.
It requires a bit of a shift in perspective.
We need you to set aside your current surroundings.
Just for a little while. Put down your phone, forget about the traffic outside or the list of things you need to do later.
Because we're transporting you back in time.
The year is 2007.
And the location is the Manitowoc County Courthouse in Wisconsin. It's a cold spring in the upper Midwest.
You can feel it in the air. The community is on edge. There are cameras outside on the courthouse steps, but inside?
Inside, the air is still and very, very serious.
In the specific format, there's no analysis, no banter. There's only the case.
You are stepping into the role of a juror.
That's your identity for the next hour.
You're not just a listener. You're a finder of fact.
Yeah.
And your duty, your sole duty, is to hear the evidence, understand the law,
weigh the arguments from the state and the defense, and ultimately decide the fate of a human being.
The defendant is Brendan Dassey.
He's 17 years old as he sits there at the defense table, but he was only 16 when the events in question happened.
He's wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit. He looks quiet, maybe a bit lost.
And he's charged with 3 incredibly serious crimes.
First-degree intentional homicide, second-degree sexual assault, and mutilation of a corpse.
So, over the course of this session, we will present the evidence exactly as it was laid out during the trial.
We'll be your guides through the testimony, the physical evidence, and the complex legal instructions you have to follow to reach a verdict.
We won't tell you what to think.
We'll simply show you what was presented. At the end, we'll pause. We'll ask you to deliberate.
And then, and only then, will we reveal the actual verdict rendered by the jury in 2007.
Okay.
Let's begin with the facts of the case, presented chronologically, just as they unfolded for everyone involved.
The story begins on Halloween, October 31st, 2005.
It's autumn in Wisconsin. The leaves are turning, the air is crisp, and a young woman named Teresa Hallback, she's 25, she's a photographer, and she has a job to do.
She works for Auto Trader magazine. It's a pretty routine assignment.
She has a scheduled appointment at the Avery Salvage Yard in Manitowoc County.
Her task is simple. She just needs to photograph a maroon Plymouth Voyager minivan that's being listed for sale.
So she arrives at the property, she takes the photos.
And then she vanishes.
Teresa Hallback was never seen alive again.
When she doesn't return home, when she doesn't show up for work, panic sets in.
A massive search effort is organized. Volunteers, law enforcement, her family, they're all combing the area.
And eventually, that search starts to focus on the Avery Salvage Yard.
And there, concealed on the property, they find her vehicle, a Toyota RAV4.
It wasn't just parked. It was hidden. They'd piled branches, old car hoods, all kinds of debris over it, trying to camouflage it.
The discovery of that car changes everything.
The property immediately becomes a crime scene. And as investigators start sifting through the salvage yard, their attention turns to a burn pit.
This pit is located directly behind the garage of Stephen Avery's residence.
And in that pit, among the ash and debris of what was clearly a large fire, they find charred bone fragments and teeth.
Forensic anthropologists would later identify these remains as belonging to Teresa Hallback.
So the evidence seems to point in one direction.
To Stephen Avery. He lived on the property, the car was found there, the bones were right behind his garage.
He was arrested and charged with her murder.
For months, the investigation focused squarely on him.
The media attention was intense. It was a national story. But as the winter of 2005 turned into the freezing start of 2006, the investigation took a really significant turn.
Investigators were trying to firm up their timeline. They needed to know exactly what happened on Halloween night. They were looking for leverage.
And in February 2006, they sit down with a young woman named Kayla Avery.
Now, Kayla is the teenage niece of Stephen Avery.
But she is also the cousin of the defendant, Brendan Dassey.
The interview starts out being about Stephen. But during the conversation, Kayla drops a piece of information that makes the investigators just pivot their entire focus.
She tells them that her cousin Brendan has been acting up lately.
And when they ask her to clarify, she describes a young man who's clearly in distress.
She said Brendan was staring into space, like he was detached from reality. She said he would just cry uncontrollably for no apparent reason.
And physically, there was a drastic change. She said Brendan had lost roughly 40 pounds in a very short period of time.
Now, to an investigator, sudden weight loss and uncontrollable crying in a teenager who's related to a murder suspect.
It signals a troubled conscience.
It signals knowledge.
So based on this statement, investigators Mark Weiger and Tom Fassbender decide they need to interview Brendan Dassey.
And we need to pause here for a second just to understand who Brendan Dassey is at this moment.
He's 16. He's a sophomore at Mishicot High School. But he's not an average student. Brendan is a special education student.
Right. He has significant cognitive limitations. His reading level is that of a low elementary student. He struggles with complex language, with social cues.
This context is absolutely vital as we get into the next phase of the timeline, the interrogations.
These interviews are the absolute centerpiece of the state's case.
And they are the primary target of the defense's counterargument. So as a juror, you really need to pay close attention to how these conversations progress.
The first major one happens on February 27, 2006. Investigators go to Brendan's high school and they pull him out of class.
In this initial interview, Brendan denies any involvement in Teresa Halbach's death.
But they keep pressing him. And as the questioning goes on, his story starts to shift.
He eventually places himself at the scene. He tells them that on Halloween night, he saw body parts in the fire in his uncle's burn pit.
And that admission, that's the turning point.
Brendan Dassey goes from being a potential witness to a suspect.
So 2 days later, on March 1st, 2006, the investigators bring Brendan to the police station for a filmed interrogation.
This video recording is the core of the entire trial. It's what you, as the jury, will watch in the courtroom. We need to walk through what happens on that tape.
So you had the investigators Wiegert and Fassbender in a room with Brendan. They aren't using aggressive tactics, no shouting.
No. Instead, they adopt this tone of solicitation, of alliance.
They tell Brendan that they already know what happened.
They tell him the police have all the information, they just need to hear it from him.
And they use a very specific phrase over and over again. They tell him that honesty would set him free.
They're presenting themselves as his advocates. They literally say, "We're in your corner, Brendan."
They're implying that if he just tells them the truth, which, is the version of the story they already believe, that he'll be helped.
And over the course of several hours, Brendan's account evolves dramatically.
He starts with denials. Then he says, okay, he went over to see his uncle. Then the story changes again. He says he went to hand over some mail.
But with continued questioning, the narrative gets much, much darker.
He describes hearing screams coming from Stephen Avery's trailer.
The investigators press him. "What did you see, Brendan? What did you do?"
And he admits to entering the trailer. He describes seeing Teresa Halbach tied to a bed in the bedroom.
And he admits to participating in a sexual assault at his uncle's direction.
The confession becomes more and more graphic.
He describes cutting Mrs. Halbach's throat while she's on the bed. He describes helping Stephen Avery carry her body from the trailer to the garage.
And then
he says she was shot in the garage. And finally, he describes placing her body in the bonfire to be destroyed.
It's a horrific story. It perfectly matches the charges. Homicide, sexual assault, mutilation.
But there's a complication, a big one. It happens immediately after this confession.
Right after the interrogation, Brendan speaks to his mother, Barb Jonda. The call is also recorded.
And in that call, the certainty that he seemed to show in the interrogation room, it just vanishes.
He tells his mother, "They got to my head."
He says he guessed at the answers. He said he guessed because that's what they wanted.
And later, Brendan formally recants the entire confession. He claims he's innocent.
He says he never even saw Teresa Halbach after she took the photos of the van. He says he made the whole story up because he felt pressured, and he thought if he just gave the officers what they wanted, they'd let him go back to class.
So this is the central tension you have to resolve.
On the one hand, a detailed, recorded confession of these gruesome crimes.
On the other, a recantation from a cognitively impaired teenager who is claiming he was coerced.
Before we get into the specific arguments from the lawyers, we need to equip you with the legal framework. You can't just decide based on a gut feeling.
Right. You have to follow the law.
So you're considering 3 charges: first-degree intentional homicide, second-degree sexual assault, and mutilation of a corpse.
The judge will read you the full formal instructions, but there is one legal concept that is absolutely critical to this case. It's called party to a crime.
This concept can be confusing, so let's break it down.
To find Brendan guilty, the state does not necessarily have to prove that he pulled the trigger.
They don't have to prove he struck the fatal blow.
Under Wisconsin statute, a person is guilty if they intentionally aid and abet the commission of a crime.
So what does that really mean? Aid and abet.
It means acting with the knowledge that another person is committing a crime, and you either assist them or you are ready and willing to assist.
So think of it this way. If you believe Brendan helped Stephen Avery, even if Avery was the ringleader, even if Avery was the one who actually killed her.
If Brendan helped move the body or clean up, or even just stood by ready to stop her from escaping, knowing what was happening.
Under the law, Brendan is just as guilty as the principal actor.
You cannot acquit him simply because you think Stephen Avery was the main killer. If Brendan was a party to the crime, he's guilty of the crime. That's the law.
However, you also have to apply the standard of proof.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the highest standard in our legal system. It is a very high bar.
The court uses a specific instruction to define this. It says that reasonable doubt is not a doubt based on guesswork or speculation.
So you can't just imagine some crazy scenario and call that reasonable doubt.
Nor is it a doubt based on sympathy or fear.
You can't acquit Brendan just because you feel sorry for him, and you can't convict him just because the crime itself scares you.
Reasonable doubt is defined as a doubt that would cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause or hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life.
So if after hearing everything, you have a feeling in your gut that makes you pause, a feeling that something isn't quite right, that the state hasn't fully proven its case,
that is reasonable doubt, and in that case, you must acquit.
There's also language in the instruction that tells you to search for the truth. The defense will argue this is dangerous language.
Why that?
Because it might confuse you. It might make you think your job is to solve the crime. But legally, your job isn't to figure out what really happened. It's to determine if the state has overcome the presumption of innocence.
Okay. So with that legal framework in mind, let's turn to the arguments. We'll start with the prosecution.
The state is represented by Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz and Tom Fallon. Their theory is straightforward and, frankly, horrifying.
Brendan Dassey was present. He knew a crime was happening, and he chose to help his uncle rape, kill, and get rid of Teresa Halbach's body.
Prosecutor Kratz argues that the March 1st confession is the key. It's what unlocks the entire mystery. He calls it the puzzle piece.
And his argument rests on a very specific premise.
He argues that Brendan provided details in that confession that only a perpetrator could possibly know.
The most significant example the state presents is what we'll call the bullet.
Okay, so during that March 1st interrogation, the investigators are trying to figure out the cause of death. The bones suggested a gunshot wound, but in the room, Brendan is struggling to get the story right.
Right. First, he says she was stabbed. Then he says his uncle cut her throat. The investigators then ask, who shot her in the head?
Initially, Brendan just guesses he did. Then he says he can't remember. Finally, after a lot of back and forth, he admits she was shot in the garage.
And here's the critical point for the prosecution.
After Brendan says this, after he places the shooting in the garage, the investigators get a new search warrant. They go back to the garage, a place they'd searched before, but maybe not as thoroughly.
And this time, they find it.
Lying on the concrete floor under a compressor, they find a flattened bullet fragment. It's cataloged as item FL.
This fragment is sent to the lab. The results come back, and they are conclusive.
It contained Teresa Halbach's DNA.
The state's argument is that Brendan provided the roadmap to this evidence.
They say without his confession placing the shooting in the garage, they never would have looked there again, never would have found it.
They argue this proves he was there. It proves the confession is true because it led them to physical reality.
The prosecution also points to corroborating physical evidence about the cleanup.
In the confession, Brendan admitted to cleaning up a reddish-black fluid on the garage floor.
And he told police they used a specific kind of unusual mixture for cleaning.
Bleach, paint thinner, and gasoline.
So investigators seized the jeans Brendan was wearing that night. They tested them, and they found bleach stains.
The state argues this is not a coincidence. You have a confession describing a cleanup with bleach, and you have his bleach-stained jeans.
They argue this physical evidence anchors his words in reality. It all lines up.
And on top of that, there are witnesses who place Brendan at the bonfire.
Right. There's testimony confirming Brendan was with Stephen Avery on Halloween night tending that fire in the pit.
And the state reminds you this is the very pit where Teresa Hellback's bones were found.
He admits to being there. He admits to seeing body parts. The state argues this makes him an active participant in the mutilation and destruction of the body.
The state's core argument on the truthfulness of the confession is, well, it's simple and intuitive.
Innocent people don't confess.
Prosecutor Kratz plays the tapes for you in open court. He wants you to hear Brendan's own voice describing the assault. He wants you to hear the details, the ropes, the knife, the gun.
And Kratz anticipates your doubts. He knows the story changed during the interrogation. He knows Brendan guessed at things.
But he argues that any inconsistencies you hear are not evidence that the story is fabricated.
He argues they are attempts by Brendan to minimize his own role.
The state's theory is that Brendan is trying to tell just enough of the truth to satisfy the police, while holding back the worst parts to protect himself. But ultimately, they say, the core of the story.
The what is corroborated by the bullet and the bleach.
So that is the case for the state. A confessed participant whose story led to evidence and is corroborated by forensics.
Now we have to turn to the defense.
Brendan is represented by Mark Fremgen and Ray Adelstein, and their task is incredibly difficult.
They have to convince you that the words coming out of their own client's mouth are a lie.
Their theory is that the confession is false, it was coerced, and it's completely unreliable.
And their argument is that if you take away that confession, there is absolutely zero physical evidence linking Brendan Dassey to this crime.
The defense attacks the interrogation tactics head-on.
They argue that investigators Wiegert and Fassbender didn't just receive information. They fed Brendan the facts.
Let's go back to that bullet. The state says Brendan knew about the shooting. The defense asks you to look much, much closer at that exchange.
The defense says Brendan was just guessing until he finally landed on the right answer.
They highlight the actual dialogue. The investigators ask, who shot her in the head? Brendan says he did. Then they ask, why didn't you tell us that?
And Brendan's reply is, because I couldn't think of it.
So the defense asks you, does that sound like a memory? I couldn't think of it.
Or does that sound like a student trying to pass a test he hasn't studied for?
They argue Wiegert and Fassbender acted as false father figures. They exploited his trust. They offered him help, told him they were in his corner.
They promised him that honesty would set him free.
The defense argues that Brendan, faced with these authority figures, simply agreed to whatever they suggested just to end the whole thing.
He thought if he said what they wanted, he could go back to his 6th-hour class.
And to support this, the defense presents evidence of Brendan's vulnerability. They bring in his school records.
They show he's a special education student, that his intellectual functioning is low average to borderline, that he has trouble with comprehension.
The defense then calls Dr. Robert Gordon, a psychologist, to the stand.
Dr. Gordon testifies that Brendan is highly suggestible.
And what does that mean exactly?
It means that people with Brendan's cognitive profile are uniquely susceptible to pressure from authority figures. They're people pleasers.
So when a police officer says, we know this happened, just say it, a suggestible person often will, even if it's not true, because they trust the authority figure more than their own memory.
Brendan himself takes this stand. It's a risky move, but he testifies in his own defense.
And when they ask him why he said those things on the tape, his answers are very simple.
I don't know, I guess I made it up.
Beyond the psychology, the defense relies very heavily on what they call the forensic void.
And this is where you, as a juror, you really have to visualize the scene that the state is describing.
The state claims Brendan and Stephen cut Teresa Hallback's throat while she was shackled to a bed. They say she was stabbed, then carried to the garage and shot.
That is a messy, bloody, violent series of events. It would involve arterial spray, blood soaking into a mattress, into the carpet, the wood.
The defense emphasizes that investigators conducted a very thorough search of Stephen Avery's trailer. They tore up the carpet, they tested the walls, they tested the bed.
And then the result of all that testing?
0. There is no DNA belonging to Brendan Dassey found anywhere in that trailer. No hair, no sweat, no skin cells, nothing.
And more importantly, there is no blood from Teresa Hallback on the bed. No blood in the bedroom at all.
The defense argues it is scientifically impossible to cut someone's throat on a bed and have 0 blood evidence left behind.
You cannot clean a mattress of blood so perfectly that forensic tests like luminol don't reveal it.
They argue that it is just impossible for a cognitively impaired teenager and his uncle to clean a crime scene so perfectly that they remove all forensic traces of the victim from the bedroom.
And all forensic traces of Brendan from the entire trailer. It just couldn't happen.
The argument is simple. If the confession is true, the bedroom should be a horror show of forensic evidence.
But the bedroom is clean. And if the bedroom is clean, the defense argues the confession must be false.
Finally, the defense presents an alibi.
Brendan says he was at home playing PlayStation. His brother, Blaine, testifies that he saw him at home after school.
The defense argues that Brendan only went over to the bonfire much later that evening, long after the alleged murder in the trailer would have happened.
He helps clean the garage, yes, but they argue it was just a spill.
Yeah.
Automotive fluid, which is common in a salvage yard, and that the police twisted this innocent fact into a murder cleanup.
So, you've heard the arguments.
On one side, you have the state. They have a confession on video, the defendant saying, "I did it." They have a bullet found in the garage where the defendant said the shooting happened. They have bleach on his jeans.
And on the other side, you have the defense. They have a complete lack of physical evidence at the alleged murder scene, a clean bedroom. They have a defendant with significant intellectual deficits who recanted almost immediately.
They argued the entire confession was fed to him by police.
The trial lasted 9 days. The testimony is closed. The jury has now retired to the deliberation room.
And this is where you come in.
We want you to pause and reflect. Just summarize the conflict in your own mind.
Remember the party to a crime instruction. Even if you think Brendan didn't actually shoot her, if he helped, he is guilty under the law.
And remember the reasonable doubt instruction. Does the lack of DNA in that bedroom cause you to pause or hesitate?
Does it make you wonder if the story on that tape is real? Or does the specific detail in the confession, the bullet, does that overcome your doubt?
Before we tell you what the jury decided, stop for a moment. If you were in the jury box, how would you vote?
If you'd like, you can pause now and think it through.
When you're ready, press play and we'll tell you what the jury decided.
Welcome back.
On April 25, 2007, the jury returned with their verdict. They had deliberated for roughly 4 hours.
In the case of State of Wisconsin v. Brendan Dassey, regarding count 1, first-degree intentional homicide, the jury found the defendant
guilty.
Regarding count 2, mutilation of a corpse, the jury found the defendant
Guilty.
Regarding count 3, second-degree sexual assault, the jury found the defendant
Guilty.
Brendan Dassey was convicted on all charges as a party to the crime.
The sentence imposed was life in prison.
The judge set his parole eligibility for November 1st, 2048.
Brendan Dassey will be 59 years old before he can even be considered for release.
This case presents just a profound challenge to any juror.
It forces you to weigh the spoken word against physical silence.
It requires deciding if a confession can be false, even when it's detailed and seems to be corroborated by a piece of evidence like that bullet.
It requires deciding if a cleanup can truly be perfect enough to fool modern forensic science.
And it forces a juror to decide if reasonable doubt exists when a teenager confesses to a crime that left no physical trace of him at the scene.
These are not easy questions.
But in our system, they are questions that have to be answered by 12 citizens in a jury box.
Thank you for serving on the jury today.
You are listening to The Jury Box.